Good evening and welcome to The Story. I'm Evan Watson in for Pat Doris this week. Our special series on the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act continues tonight. Earlier this week, we focused on the northern spotted owl and the gray wolf, both very different tales that carry their own set of conflicts and circumstances. Tonight, we're looking at one of the Northwest's most important animals at risk of extinction, the Pacific salmon. Many of the region's most iconic fish runs were protected under the Endangered Species Act more than 3 decades ago. And while some have shown signs of recovery, others still teeter on the brink, like the Columbia River Chinook, Snake River sockeye, and Willamette steelhead. It's hard to overstate the importance of salmon, a species woven into the very fabric of the Northwest, its economy, its culture, and its environmental well-being. And few have felt the salmon's decline more than the indigenous tribes who have shared this region with the iconic fish for generations.
Salmon is really the heart of our culture. You know, we're salmon people.
Danila Miller is a member of Yakima Nation, and for her, salmon are much more than just fish.
When we're born, you know, we drink our mother's milk, but salmon was always our first food. That was the first solid food that I ate. And so it's our responsibility to care for them.
Miller is also fisheries science manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Evaluating the hatchery programs. We have a genetics lab in southern Idaho, and we have a river ecology project.
She's had a front row seat as salmon populations have declined over the last several decades. To understand the threats facing salmon, you have to understand the complexity of their life cycle.
They're a highly migratory species. They begin life hatching in the upper portions of watersheds in tributaries of the system. And they move their way down out of those tributaries into the major river systems. They then find their way to the estuaries. They go to the ocean to mature. Right.
Kim Kratz is an assistant regional administrator with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're the federal agency charged with overseeing salmon recovery. And he explains that throughout their lives, salmon face threats at nearly every turn.
Traditionally, we looked at the threats to salmon by the 4 H's. There's habitat, there's harvest, there's hatcheries, and there's the hydro system.
More recently, sea lions and predatory birds have been added to the list of threats.
And then there's climate change. And climate change adds and increases the risk to all of those 4 H's.
It's a complex issue, and you can't pinpoint one specific thing. I always refer to it as death by 1,000 cuts.
While salmon face many threats, dams stand out among them. Each of the dozens of dams throughout the Columbia and Willamette River system present an obstacle to salmon. They're hard to pass for young fish who are following the current out to the Pacific. And they're just as hard to get by for adult salmon, trying to navigate back to their spawning grounds.
We are constantly evaluating.
That's where Tim Dykstra comes in. He's in charge of making sure salmon can get past the dams.
And in the case of the Army Corps of Engineer dams on the 4 lower Columbia and the 4 lower Snake dams, they all have effective fish ladders that quickly and effectively pass adult fish back to their spawning grounds.
Dykstra said the Army Corps has changed its operations so that fewer young salmon die passing through the turbines.
So we've installed major infrastructure upgrades, screens that divert fish from entering the turbines. We've provided a lot of spill at the spillway at the dams so that they have non-turbine routes to pass.
But dams do more than just create barriers for salmon. They create low-cost, carbon-free electricity, and they facilitate shipping and irrigation for farmers.
We recognize there are impacts of dams, we recognize there are benefits of dams, and we take our fish and wildlife responsibilities very seriously.
But dams also fundamentally change how the river flows.
The great river of the West tearing toward the sea at Salo Falls.
Those falls were the water purifiers.
Wilbur Slockish Jr. is an elder with the Klickitat band of Yakima Nation. He remembers fishing at Salo Falls, a series of thundering cascades that used to be east of the Dalles.
Oh, man, that's a sound that can't be replicated. And the fish, there was plenty of fish all the time because the water was cold, free flowing.
Today, the falls are quiet. inundated when the dams went up.
They flooded spawning beds behind Bonneville Dam, where our people fished.
And that gets to another big threat for salmon: habitat loss. Along the coast, tidal estuaries have been converted to pastures. Further inland, vast wetland areas have been cut off from the river. The Polensky Wildlife Area, just north of Portland on the backwaters of the Willamette, is one of those areas. A few years ago, it was more than 400 acres of disconnected habitat, parts of it cut off from the river for nearly a century by culverts and water diversions.
What we did here was we actually lowered over about a 4.5 acre area. We actually brought down the marsh plain about 2.5 feet. And so this
Tom Josephson, with the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, helped lead the restoration project in the wildlife area.
And so now fish can get from that slough channel into these wetland areas back in here, and it provides a lot more landscape connectivity across the site.
And his agency worked closely with the Bonneville Power Administration, which runs the hydropower side of the dams on the Columbia River.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Jason Karnezis leads the estuary program for BPA, and he says projects like this one are meant to offset the damage that dams do.
As a federal agency, you take the responsibility of recognizing the impacts that you have on the environment. You put that work on the ground as best you can according to the science.
And while the work will be good for salmon, he stressed that it's about more than that.
So we're trying to restore processes, not just a specific one-size-fits-all habitat for salmonids.
Whether habitat restoration projects like this one will work will take time to tell, but Karnezis is confident.
We've documented those things over time and have found that the adage of if you build it, they will come is true.
But even some programs created to help salmon haven't quite worked out as planned. Since the late 1800s, people have been using salmon hatcheries to augment fish stocks.
What we try to do, what hatcheries are intended to do, is to boost harvest opportunities while at the same time reducing the risk to ESA-listed fish.
But intent and reality don't always align. Kratz said that hatchery fish have altered genetics, giving those salmon lower chances of survival.
It seems like they're less able to respond to some of the threats that they've got because they have a more homogeneous set of DNA.
And you don't need to be a scientist to notice the difference between hatchery and wild fish.
The fish have gotten smaller since they put into those little salmon reservations that are called hatcheries.
The real danger, though, comes if hatchery fish breed with their wild counterparts, passing along those inferior genes. Kratz said hatchery managers are careful about when they release hatchery fish to limit their interaction with wild salmon. But the idea that hatcheries could bring salmon back from the brink has proven false.
You know, it used to be that we thought that hatcheries were a direct replacement for declining fish populations, and now we realize that hatcheries provide an important benefit and they can be used for conservation, but they're not the silver bullet.
So with threats coming at salmon from all sides, why are people still allowed to fish for them? Simply put, salmon are foundational for a big part of the Northwest economy.
These fisheries provide tens of thousands of jobs. There are hundreds of communities that are reliant for a resilient economy on these fisheries.
But they're also more than that.
They're part of the fabric of the West Coast region with respect to culture and the economy. With respect to the indigenous people, it's part of they're inextricable from their culture, from their economy, from their art, from their ceremony.
And that's what makes the issue so personal for people like Wilbur Slockish and Danella Miller.
All of this is really emotional for me because it's part of who I am and my culture.
And it's that cultural connection that keeps Miller working to save salmon.
And I see it as just carrying on the work of my elders and my ancestors, and and setting the stage for our future generations to continue on this work to protect our environment.
Despite the setbacks, there have been signs of progress. Some runs like Oregon Coast Coho and Hood Canal Chum have shown promising signs of recovery. And the biggest dam removal in U.S. history is currently underway on the Klamath River, which will restore access to hundreds of miles of salmon habitat. But for true change to happen, Miller says it will take a fundamental shift in how people interact with their environment.
The tribal perspective that I grew up with, that I was taught by my ancestors, is that our natural resources were put here to sustain us And so it's our responsibility to care for them and ensure their existence for future generations.
The Endangered Species Act, for all the good it's done, won't be enough.
I think it has the potential that it could be the most powerful tool that we have to protect species from extinction, but we've really yet to see the success of that. All of these species listed in the 90s in the Columbia River Basin, how many of those have been restored?
Slockish knows he'll never see salmon runs like his ancestors did, but he still remembers the first salmon he ever caught and the message it delivered.
Just like looked me in the eye, and I looked at him, and I got the message there. I did my job. Now you do yours. You take care of me.
Reporter Cale Williams joins me now. And Cale, great story there. First question for you. You talk about the cultural and the economic impacts of salmon here. What about the ecological as well?
Yeah, I mean, they play a really important role in the ecosystem. Salmon, they go out to sea. They spend about 1 to 5 years out there. They fatten up. They're eating all the stuff they need to eat.
Yeah.
And then they swim back to their spawning grounds where they die, and they take all those nutrients and they leave them there. And those are important for animals that scavenge on their carcasses and for the environment itself.
A key link in the chain of how the whole system works there, really.
Exactly.
And then also when people think salmon and think impacts, they often look to the Snake River and dams as well. What's happening there right now?
Yeah, so there was a lawsuit filed in 2021. This was filed by a bunch of environmental groups and some tribes that sued the federal government over the impacts of these dams. That litigation is in mediation now, and a leaked document that came out just last month said that the federal government was willing to provide up to $1 billion to tribes to offset some of the hydropower that'd be lost with other renewables in the area. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that these dams are going to be breached anytime soon, because there are other impacts that a lot of people who are against breaching the dams worry about: navigation, irrigation, those types of things. And to actually breach the dams would take approval by Congress, so not happening anytime soon.
Okay, something I'm sure we'll be watching here as well. And what's coming tomorrow?
Tomorrow we're going to take a step back and look at the Endangered Species Act from a wider lens. We're going to take the 10,000-foot view and really ask, for all the strife, for all the conflict, for all the fighting, is the Endangered Species Act working? And if it's not, how can it be changed to be better?
Great. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Cale. We'll see that tomorrow. Now it's your turn. What do you think about the declining salmon numbers and the work being done to try and restore them? Share your thoughts and questions with us. Cale will work to answer your questions during our wrap-up segment on Friday. Email thestory@kgw.com or call and leave us a voicemail, 503-226-5090. Now let's feature a few of your thoughts on Cale's piece from last night, diving into the resurgence of gray wolves in Oregon. And by the way, if you missed any of Cale's pieces so far this week, you can find them now on the KGW YouTube channel. We heard from many of you who agree with a viewer named Scott.
I think we should just leave the wolves alone. They were here before we were, just like the guy just said. There was millions of wolves running around before we got here. They belong here, and we do too. Leave them alone.
Then Don wrote to us, personally, I am in favor of having wolves. Ranchers are compensated for wolf kills of cattle, and problem wolves are killed. Besides, it is those methane-belching cows that help cause global warming.
Thank you for bringing the conversation to light. The wolves were here way before we were. They make the land healthier, the wildlife healthier, the fishing, streams, and rivers healthier. Who do we think we are? We're giving in to greed. These greedy ranchers are driving around in brand new $50,000 plus trucks and crying about their lifestyle.
Several of you also thought that Cale left out an important group of people feeling the effect of the wolves' return.
You guys did forget about the other people when it comes to wolves, and that would be the hunters who see everything in the woods and would inform you that the wolves are decimating the big game animals. As some parts of eastern Oregon, the deer have almost vanished due to the wolves and all the predators. There was a reason settlers eradicated that animal, because it is a top predator and a very efficient hunter.
Another viewer wrote on our YouTube channel, "Now we get to see them eat all of our elk, deer, and any other wild game we like to eat." And Maverick responded to that comment online, writing, "I see both sides, but from my experience, nature is healthier with them. They tend to hunt the old, sick, and weak, helping keep the herds healthier. Unlike me and my fellow hunters, who either A, take the large rack trophies, or B, take spikes for better meat." Remember, keep those questions and comments coming. We're already compiling some of your feedback to feature in Friday's story, and Kale will work to answer some of your questions then. Well, up next on The Story, it's a new approach to addiction on the streets of Portland, courtesy of Portland Police. A pilot program that began today helps bridge the divide between people suffering from addiction and recovery providers. But how does Measure 110 fit into all of this? There are still a lot of unknowns, but we'll share the details we've uncovered so far when The Story returns. As a reporter, we often stumble on stories while we're out in the field working on another story. Such was the case for our Blair Best today. Earlier today, she was in Oldtown working on a story about a new storage option for homeless people's belongings. We'll bring you that story tomorrow. But in the midst of gathering those elements, Blair discovered a pilot program that started today, this morning, working to get drug users off the streets and connected to services.
On the streets of Oldtown, it's easy to go unnoticed.
I'm scared, alone.
These two struggle with an addiction to just about
Everything.
everything.
A lot of us don't know where to start or where to go for any kind of services.
It's that disconnect Portland Police is now trying to fix.
So we're trying to kind of break that cycle now by just starting to, introduce people to service providers who can come out on the street that moment and hopefully make those connections that, convince people to go into recovery.
It's a new approach to addiction that hit the streets Wednesday morning.
Today is a pilot project. This is the first day, very early stages. So when we interact with folks on the street who are actively using in public spaces and they express any interest in getting help, we're able to connect them in that moment with a social worker and then hopefully steer them into treatment.
That's been the missing piece.
It's also where Joe Bezeghi and his team at Recovery Works Northwest come in. When police find someone willing to get help, they send the outreach workers.
The window of openness to recovery, it's short and it closes quickly. So being able to meet people where they're at when they're ready, that leads to, roads to long-term wellness.
As opposed to what they've been doing under Measure 110, which is giving people using in public a fine and a number to call for treatment.
But it's nice to see that they're helping instead of just giving people a hard time.
The bike squad is able to take on such a project with the help of state troopers.
We just have more presence out there, we can cover more ground and reach more people.
It would give them a chance to see us as actual people.
Now again, this is just the first day of the project, so there are still a lot of unknowns, like if this new approach will fully replace the Measure 110 approach. And the outreach workers are already telling us, for this to continue, they're going to need a lot more staff. There also needs to be a lot more detox beds available for people who agree to get help. For some context, there are just over 100 detox beds in Portland, but the need is far greater than that. Blair Best, KGW News.
Up next on the story, a Southern Oregon man who booby-trapped a property that he lost in a lawsuit learned his fate in federal court earlier this month. We'll show you around his Indiana Jones-themed traps, which injured a federal officer, and how much time a judge handed down to the 72-year-old when the story returns. We are in the final week of the KGW Great Toy Drive. If you would like to bring some joy to a child this holiday season, please drop off a new unwrapped toy at any IQ Credit Union, Fred Meyer, or local Toyota dealership. We have 2 more collection events this weekend, your last chance to drop off toys. The first is Saturday at the Wood Village Fred Meyer. I'm going to be there, so come by and say hello. Or you can find some of the KGW team at Cedar Hills Crossing in Beaverton on Sunday. Thanks for helping us make the holidays all a little brighter. Now to a story about a man in Southern Oregon who turned one bad day into a bad decade plus. 72-year-old Gregory Rodvelt was sentenced to 12.5 years in federal prison last week. Court documents show that Rodvelt lost a property he owned because of a lawsuit. He apparently did not like that very much at all. So he set up a maze of traps, one of which hurt a federal officer. When law enforcement arrived at the property on September 7, 2018, with the person who was going to take possession, they found a minivan blocking the gate with steel animal traps hidden under the hood. They also found homemade spike strips along the long gravel driveway. A sign warned, "Property is protected by improvised munitions." A hot tub, that hot tub, was rigged to roll down a hill if anyone opened the gate. Police and the FBI used an explosive charge to breach the front door. While entering, investigators bumped into that wheelchair. It triggered a homemade shotgun device which fired and hit an FBI bomb tech in the leg. He was treated at a hospital and released. A closer look revealed the booby trap used fishing line as a tripwire, which set off a mouse trap, triggering a shotgun shell. Rodvelt was later arrested in Arizona. He had previously been involved in a series of violent incidents, including domestic abuse, according to public records. This, perhaps, is most creative. In 2017, Rodvelt made headlines for barricading himself inside an SUV with a gun and refusing to leave an Arizona highway. Even though that incident happened back in 2018, Rodvelt was not convicted until this past June. He faced up to 20 years in prison, but a judge decided that 12.5 years for the 72-year-old would suffice, along with 3 years of supervised release. Well, that is the end of our show. Thanks so much for watching this evening. The good stuff is coming your way next, and be sure to tune into the story tomorrow. We'll have part 4 of Kill Series, and I'll be reporting from Salem, where the Oregon Supreme Court is set to hear arguments in a lawsuit against Measure 113. Several GOP senators are challenging the ballot measure, saying they should be able to run for re-election despite their unexcused absences during the past session, saying the language in the measure is not clear, despite how most voters interpreted it. You might remember from the walkouts this summer, there was a lot of drama around this. Now we're reaching the culmination point. There's a lot to get to. I hope you join the team tomorrow at 6:30, and I hope you have a great night tonight.